LBM's asleep, so there's a chance that she wakes up, but she was pretty knackered, and I have not slept much since I got home. So, yeah, anyway, she slept in 2-hour increments last night. So
Chop, chop is your message to us.
I have to shamefully confess, I've had the best 2 nights sleep of the conclusion of any COP I've been to.
Shut up, Tennant.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording on Wednesday the 13th of December amidst the debris and detritus of COP28 in Dubai. And I'm joined, as always, by my 2 co-hosts. With us remotely from Sydney is Global Vice President of Marketing and Extortion, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, gentlemen. I'm here on Gadigal land in body and still in Dubai in spirit with you both.
And with me, in corporeal form in Dubai, is a man who, according to senior Australian climate officials, is the co-host that brings the giggles to the podcast, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Stating that I am in corporeal form is the nicest thing that's been said to me today.
And actually in pretty good form. You were just telling us, Tennant, that of the many COPs that you've been to, this is one of the kindest on observers. You've actually got a few hours of sleep over the course of the last 48 hours.
Yeah, it's been pretty great. I did have a late one the night before last, but then I got some sleep after that. And then last night was great because they weren't including observers in any way, really, in the final sort of 24 hours of this shindig. So the parties suffered and the presidency suffered through endless nights.
And all we suffered was FOMO.
That's right. Intense FOMO.
Summer uppers, for context. Last year, when I'd also had to come home to be with my first little tiny human, I was sent photos of these 2 slumped against a bin somewhere on grounds in Sharm el-Sheikh. It was a pretty sad state of affairs as they were observing the final goings-on.
Well, yes. I think technically, though, that was in a response to a photo of you in front of the pyramids because you hadn't quite got home by that point. You were living it up in Cairo.
I forgot that small detail. It was the FOMO I was served up in return. I gave you a Sphinx. You gave me recycling.
On this week's show, we wrap week 2 of COP28 and share our reactions to the dramatic concluding plenary that has just wrapped up here in Dubai. So I know there's a lot to talk about beyond the global stocktake, but the GST, as it became known, was really the main event of COP28. And as we expected, the debate on what, if any, wording on fossil fuels to include in the stocktake was the fulcrum around which the entire COP turned. So think about how to get into this. I want to go back a few days because the thing that really kicked the COP into another gear was on Sunday when the COP president, Sultan Al Jaber, convened a majlis, a plenary meeting in the format of a traditional Arabic conference of discussion and debate among equals. This saw parties seated in a circle, all facing each other, no desks, and asked to throw away the talking points and speak from the heart. Tennant, you were in the room for this session. What struck you about it?
So it was a bit confronting for the leaders involved, the ministers and chief negotiators for the various delegations. They weren't just asked; they were pulled up on failing to speak from the heart. Chin up, said the president to the European Commission.
That's right. They were the sacrificial lamb who just assumed that the COP president was not serious.
Yes,
about this speaking from the heart thing.
Yeah, and so overall, that meeting, I think they would have done a bit better if they'd had a second go at it, frankly. Everybody, I think, was not really informed what it was going to be like before they did it. And some took to the format much better than others. The Colombian minister was terrific and heartfelt and very much going off script or giving the amazing impression of doing so, whereas others did read talking points. Now, the president kept referring to this then and at the end and subsequently as the change makers majlis, and that this was the moment when parties opened their hearts and showed flexibility and came out of their comfort zones and began to get things done. I've got to say, it did not quite seem at the time like people were coming out of their comfort zones and getting things done. There was some flexibility, importantly signalled by a few. But there were some very hard-edged positions put by several, and the gap seemed yawning.
Is it fair to say that a lot of the countries who spoke in that session, including Australia, Minister Bowen was in that session as well, you saw quite a lot of parties, like a majority, I think, who spoke that emphasised their desire to see language on the phasing out of fossil fuels, and that the draft text that had been provided really hadn't met expectations, and there was flexibility from a lot of those parties saying we will work with you on the language around that. And then there was just intransigence from a few others, like Saudi Arabia, and I think the grouping tenet that we'd refer to as the like-minded developing countries, LMDC, it's acronym soup when it comes to negotiating groups, that resisted any reference to specific technologies, hence not wanting coal, oil and gas called out. And that was really the sort of central debate that sort of raged the following few days.
Yeah. And in that group, I have to say this time, Saudi Arabia was actually the smiling, open-minded deal maker of the group, which had a spectrum within it, I think quite carefully choreographed. With one end of that being Saudi Arabia saying, well, the problem is greenhouse gases. It's not sources of greenhouse gases, and we need all solutions to scale up. So, let's talk. Stretching from that at one end through China and India in the middle of that grouping, saying, agreeing anything that called on parties to do anything in the context of the GST would be beyond the mandate of that the Paris Agreement gives for the stocktake, which is meant to be non-policy prescriptive. And then at the far end of that spectrum, yelling floridly at anyone within range was Bolivia, who went on at every opportunity about carbon colonialism and the need for the lying hypocrites of the developed world to transition from fossil fuels immediately, literally immediately, and to be carbon negative as soon as possible so as to make space for developing countries to open up more fossil fuels themselves. So that was like a tough crowd to negotiate with.
It was. And I think you're right in calling out Bolivia on behalf of the LMDC as probably the most unconstructive contribution, but you didn't have to travel far to the most constructive, which we've mentioned, which was Colombia. We had Susana Mohammed, the Environment Minister of Colombia, give a couple of really powerful speeches over the course of the COP. One of them was in the Magellas. She, as you say, spoke off the cuff. She reflected really honestly about the challenges as a politician coming into the COP process. And, she acknowledged she had a great negotiating team. They were doing great work. But for what she regarded as a fundamentally political process, felt like there were constraints being imposed on her because of, the accreted history of 28 COPs.
I feel trapped sometimes by my own technical team, she said.
Yeah.
She also spoke really powerfully about, in a developing country context, how financial flows are not oriented in the right direction for supporting this transition. And she called out, a specific decision from, her government to not allow new permits for coal mining, I think specifically. And as a result of that, their currency was downgraded almost immediately.
Yeah, drop in the peso, downgraded credit rating.
Yeah.
There was it sort of underlined the fact that there's a fundamental misalignment in the incentives in the global economic system and what is being asked of countries in this context, which was, I think, really useful context and analysis. And was given really in the spirit of what the COP president was asking. Now, it's important to point out that while I think the COP president, Sultan Al Jaber, really appreciated this intervention, a lot of cutaway shots of him smiling at the minister, he was also very quick to point out that reforming the entire global financial system was out of scope for COP28. But I think what it did do was helped developed countries and their representatives put themselves in the shoes of developing countries and built that empathy. And it's really interesting the way that we talk about these nations as monoliths, but it's been some of the personal stories that have been shared across the course of the COP. There's been multiple references from heads of delegation to thinking of their families back home and the implications of the decisions that have been made here in Dubai for them and their lives have been most powerful, and I think at times have helped move the needle.
Yeah. One of the interventions I had really enjoyed in that Majlis was from the delegate, I think from the Cook Islands, I want to say. It was a Pacific nation. I might need to check that.
The party who said that they have a similar format for meeting in the Pacific was Samoa.
Oh, Samoa. Okay. But he spoke about the fact that in his country they had a similar style of gathering where people come into a circle, and he was headed back, to his home after this, where he would be meeting with the youth of his country, and he wanted to be able to go into that setting feeling proud that he'd, worked towards a decision that was going to, ensure their future. So it was it was very much a plea from the heart. The other thing I wanted to say about the intervention of Colombia in that setting was that it, for mine, really powerfully tied together the two conversations that we're having in these COPs around mitigation ambition and financing, and why developing countries are so keen to make sure that those two things are often considered together and can't be distinguished. And I think it's useful for Australia to reflect on perhaps how lucky we are in some respects that we don't consider financing as much of a barrier here. We have access to competitive finance. There's, by and large, plenty of capital that is ready to move and finance, renewable energy projects or things like that. When you hear from some of these other countries with bad credit ratings, they're saying access to capital comes at a 30% interest rate in some places. So the scale of that transformation for those economies is all the harder for that. So when they come to these, COPs and the access of finance for developing countries is on the table. Like, it's not a nice to have, it's actually critical for them to be able to commit to progress.
Well, at the point where the Majlis was called, the global stocktake was still in the form in which it had been handed over from the negotiating team. It was a thicket of optional ideas and optional clauses that really hadn't been resolved, but provided some pathways forward, but not a lot of clarity on which pathway would be taken. And following the Majlis, the COP presidency took on the task of drafting new text in all work streams, including the GST. So things got pretty quiet for a while, and then new text in all of those areas, including the global stocktake, dropped late Monday Dubai time.
With a thud.
With a thud. Yeah. It was not welcomed. It teed up a dramatic heads of delegation meeting that started a little before 10 p.m. and didn't finish until after 2 a.m. And that was a pretty fiery session.
Yeah.
Right?
It was. It started with a very long parade of parties from the developed world, so Australia speaking for the umbrella group of countries, or basically the non-Europe advanced economies, but also similar words from Europe, from the United States in its own right, from the small island states and the least developed countries, really strongly pushing back against two major weaknesses, as they saw it, in the presidency's draft, and those were both around the energy words. So in the last episode, we spoke about the triple-double and the words around, or the options around fossil fuel phase-out or other words about fossil fuels. And this had very weak words on fossil fuels, but also all the energy language was encapsulated in a header paragraph, a bit of text called a chapeau, which lends meaning and interpretation to the text below it, which basically said, well, this is an a la carte menu of stuff that you could do or not do, or something else entirely.
Well, you could just go down to the restaurant down the street and order something that's not even on this menu.
Yeah. Like hefty serving of new fossil fuels.
Well, wasn't the wording that was in that chapeau could include before the list of the various a la carte options?
Could include inter alia.
Yeah.
Yes. And so there were a huge number of parties complaining about that, saying 2 week, 2 week, 2 week. Now, there were also some of those parties, very, very strong messages here, again from Colombia, but also from Brazil, being really very constructive, but keeping people honest, and South Africa even more so, that the high ambition that they wanted to see on mitigation had to move in tandem with high ambition on equity, on support from the developed world to the developing world, and equity inside countries in how they pursue these paths. Now, against that, the reaction to the text that we've described from the LMDC was very negative too. And for them, the problem was the technology words were too strong. The energy words were too strong. It was singling out fossil fuels still for some mention, even though it wasn't really or very operative. And the whole thing was too policy prescriptive. There were also criticisms, I should say, not just from the LMDC, but from the African group of countries who were concerned that their economic and sustainable development interests were being restrained rather than assisted. So that meeting, it did go on and on and on. It was exhausting. And I have to confess, at the end of that meeting, at 2:15, I thought, my goodness, how on earth does the presidency, who had promised to take all this away and think about it, and come up with new text that would be greatly streamlined, how on earth do they bring these parties together? Because they seemed miles apart.
Yes. And that's where you saw, as those reactions were absorbed, both here at COP28 but also in the media commentary, there was a strong sense that, we were on the brink of collapse.
Yep.
Like it was all just going to fall apart, and this sort of high-stakes strategy of the COP presidency taking text and trying to average out all of these different positions, it was so general that it sort of seemed to please no one.
Yep.
Like no one was on board, no one was happy,
Yes.
which is a feat in itself, I suppose.
Yes, of a sort. It inspired the question of whether that text was a serious go at saying where the centre ground was, or if it was part of some six-dimensional chess by the presidency to inspire a counter-reaction from the higher ambition groupings to make it clear that weak ambition would not be accepted.
Would not fly. Yeah.
And I don't know if that was the plan, but that is in fact what happened.
One of the really obvious points of criticism they should have expected when they produced that text compared to the previous version, which had, I think, almost all the options beside the no text option on the energy transition piece, call out the phase out of fossil fuels with various qualifiers. Yes. To have it go from a list of 3 or 4 options, which all said various versions of that, to the phase down of unabated coal with no mention of oil and gas or sort of fossil fuels in general, was bound to provoke a big reaction, especially given who the president is, the country that he represents, and that was certainly a focus of a lot of the media commentary as well.
Yeah. You could have got the impression that there was nothing on the agenda at this COP except for phase out of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Which, like, in part is because the words fossil fuels have not been in an agenda or a decision until now, which sounds a bit weird.
It's not really relevant.
Yeah, well, you could get a job with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I think, there, Luke.
Yeah, my reaction to the text at that point was, because as you say, it evolved from various versions of phase out to lots of different ways of characterising sort of similar things. And there was, in the intervening period between the Majlis and the presentation of this text, there'd been the talk around COP was kind of like, well, we're probably not going to get phase out, but there might be maybe there's another form of words that could be arrived at that everybody would be okay with. And it seems like the process that the presidency went through was to collect all of those words and put them one after the other in various subclauses.
They might have put them in the blender first. That's true. And there were signals sent in the Majlis and after by a number of countries and groupings that what they wanted was the sense of getting off fossil fuels.
Yep.
And they could, show flexibility with specific words, but the sense needed to be there.
Yep.
And that it wasn't just, as Australia's Minister Chris Bowen said, it wasn't just about emissions from just emissions. It's about fossil fuels, because you can't deal with the detail of that transition without recognising and grappling with the realities of that transition. You can't just keep it. I like keeping an eye on abstract numerical totals as much as anyone, and maybe more, but you can't just do that.
Yes. One other thing I want to call out about this iteration of the draft text, because it was very significant for me that what survived in this text was the emissions reduction ambition that had been identified in the technical report of the global stocktake, which was a 43% global reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and 60% by 2035. And the call from the technical report that is what we would need to do to keep 1.5 degrees in sight. And it was kind of buried in a very long list of clauses in the middle. It wasn't really linked to anything in that version of the text, but it was there. And that is incredibly important for when we start thinking about NDCs and some of the expectations. And its position in the text evolved. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because what happened after this fiery meeting is that the COP presidency said, okay, we're going to go away, we're going to have a think about all of the comments that you made, and we're going to produce new text. There was some suggestion that they were going to slim down the text, which I guess didn't really happen.
Yeah, so it may have dropped a page or so, but it was like 22 pages before and it's 21 now. And
so that sort of turned out to be a red herring. But while they were sort of off doing that, this gets us to Tuesday. Tuesday, pretty quiet day for the few hardy cop tragics that remained in Dubai. There's lots of wandering around. There was a bit of VR.
There was some sipping of cocktails. Not as hard a life at the COP as you might have gotten the impression from time to time. There was a lot of work done as well.
I think we did a reasonable job, Tennant, of examining the various merits of the Star Wars trilogies.
Glad to hear you were using your time wisely.
Well, of course, they were in the breaks between us, sort of, prodding people on the way past and waggling our eyebrows and,
Largely without effect. We found out very little yesterday because the presidency was just doing like a very long series of bilateral consultations with probably everybody. I think they were doing consultations, from what the president said earlier, till 3, 4, 5 a.m. this morning.
Yep.
And everything else was closed. It was under the radar.
There was some thought that there might be some sort of intervention. By the end of the day, that didn't occur in any kind of significant way. And as it turns out, the conclusion was formed 9-10 p.m. last night that not much was going to happen before Wednesday, and that we should probably go home, go to bed, get some beauty sleep, and see where we were in the morning.
And where we turned out to be was suddenly there was a text. There were several texts for the various different topics, and there was a plenary scheduled for 10. It slipped to 10:30, but not too bad. And the text, well, everybody started getting their heads around them. The text was pretty good.
Yeah.
Oh, differences of view around the traps.
No. Because I was back home at that point. When I saw that plenary scheduled, I wonder whether we were up for another round of, comments and disagreements on the latest text. And so
I don't think you were the only one.
Well, so this is what I wanted to ask, because we haven't had the chance to talk about this, was whether there was any sense on the ground that this was the text that was essentially going to be agreed, or whether we were, up for round 3 or 4 of arguments and representations. And so in watching the people gather, because I was streaming this on my TV at home, totally tragic, but everyone in the room as they were gathering was looking very chatty and generally happy, which seemed to indicate that we were headed for agreement. But I was keen to get a sense from you both on what that felt like on the ground.
Well, when you say on the ground, we were in an identical room to the room where it happened, but it was still the room where it didn't happen. It was a room with big TVs, and we were streaming it too.
It's famous song from Hamilton. The room exactly like the room where it happened, but adjacent. Not one of Lin-Manuel Miranda's finest works.
I'm sure he can punch it up a bit. The president of the COP seemed super happy, and then basically he opened the meeting and he presented the GST for decision. And he looked around. He barely even looked around. And he said, "There being no objection, it is so decided." And it was done like that.
And down the gavel comes. Talk to the gavel.
And I don't know if you saw this in the stream, but obviously then everyone started clapping.
Yes.
But then I think John Kerry stood up. I thought he might have been one of the first to stand up. And then it turned into like a standing ovation. And the president was obviously looking very, very happy.
He beamed.
Yeah. So to answer your question, Frankie, I didn't really have a sense of the mood in the room from where we were. It certainly wasn't my assumption that it would just get waved through in the way that it was. Yep. I fully expected there to be more back and forth, argy-bargy. It seemed unlikely. While the text had changed quite a bit, it clearly hadn't changed enough that everybody was suddenly going to be hunky-dory with it.
Yeah.
And there had been some red lines drawn that had remained crossed. But let's rewind and say, well, what did we see when we woke up this morning and downloaded the text? There's a few things that are significant for me. That phrasing around 43% emissions reduction on 2019 levels by 2030 and 60% by 2035 had been moved immediately before the clause on various interventions in kind of fossil fuel reduction and energy system transformation.
Yep. And
so they were linked far more strongly than they had been in the previous text, and that ambition, which comes from the technical report, is taken straight from the scientists that had prepared that report, really act as a preamble for everything that is discussed subsequently. Do you want to talk about what happened with the chapeau?
I will talk about the chapeau, but I'll just add one thing on the emissions targets or the emissions levels that need to be achieved globally in order to be consistent with 1.5, which is that the most difficult of those numbers is one we haven't, I think, spoken about yet, which is that global emissions need to peak by 2025 in order to be on something approaching that path. And that was difficult because there is one country in particular that needs to peak by 2025 and has not yet committed to doing so for the numbers to add up globally, and that's China. Because they are a gigantic fraction of the world's greenhouse gas emissions these days. And so they're very sensitive about this. They have committed to update their targets, not just for 2035, but also for 2030 in 2025. And this is possibly when they will announce that they have peaked and it's all downhill from here. But they're not ready to do that yet for several reasons. And so there was all this argy-bargy about whether they could be chivied into making this commitment. And an awful lot of words were added around the 2025 peak.
It's like word camouflage.
It is.
But it's in there.
It is in there. So what they did with the chapeau, the framing for all the energy stuff, is really, certainly relative to what was there before, make it quite strong. So they recognise the need for deep, rapid and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in line with 1.5C pathways, and they call on parties to contribute to the following global efforts leading into the list in a nationally determined manner, taking into account the Paris Agreement and their different national circumstances, pathways and approaches, which is quite a clever way of dealing with the fact, not just that everyone's very sensitive and defensive, but that the positions and circumstances of countries really do differ in ways that would mean you couldn't just mechanically map like a tripling of renewables goal to every country therefore must triple renewables.
So what is then very interesting when you consider the inclusion of, 43% reduction by 2030 and 60% by 2035, given all that preamble, which makes it clear that we need to take account of countries' collective but differentiated circumstances, implies that developed countries should be doing more.
Yes.
So, if we're looking at that from an Australian context, those figures ought to be considered the floor of what we would be considering committing to with our next round of NDCs. And the other thing that was significant along those lines in the speeches from parties that followed this standing ovation was John Kerry saying that he had, recognised that many would have liked clearer language on fossil fuels, but had welcomed the language that, NDCs need to be aligned to 1.5, and had said that US and China, who had come together with the Sunnylands Compact, from which language I think was taken or, informed some of what ended up here, that they would both together take account of this in revisiting their own NDCs for the next round, which is pretty significant. I think potentially sets a very high bar.
Yeah. They're updating their long-term strategies. Australia's updating its long-term strategy, and we've got a lot to update. So the stuff that sits below that natty, freshly brushed up chapeau is now the triple-double, which is they took the numbers out. So there were previously illustrative numbers of 11,000 gigawatts of renewables and, 4-point-something% energy efficiency.
Yeah, it's been sitting around 2% improvement year on year, and they wanted to get it up to around 4.1.
Now they're just saying double. They've got accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power, accelerating efforts globally towards net zero emissions energy systems, utilising zero and low carbon fuels, which some people will be worried about those words, well before or by around mid-century.
I find that very contradictory language. But anyway.
Well, I think one can read that in the context of the chapeau, right? Which is that different countries are going to have different pathways. So for some countries, it should be well before.
Sure.
Yeah.
And some countries, it should be by around.
I think that's a heroic effort to read intelligence into something that was produced by very tired
being an
people.
active reader, Tennant.
Yeah, well,
But I think, I know we'll go through the rest of that list, but that particular clause there, I think, is going to be the cause of ongoing angst from various parties that have already stated their reservations about it and have said that they consider this a major loophole that's going to basically provide for unabated use of fossil gas.
I'd like to circle back to this idea of loopholes in this context, because I think some people misunderstand.
we've got some
this
shade in our
text.
future.
Anyway,
Let's get to paragraph or subparagraph D, because that's where the action really starts. Transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. So not the phase out words that many had sought, and like phase out had become quite totemic for a lot of people, but transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. So not all fossil fuels are covered by this paragraph or subparagraph. Now, what does all that amount to? Oh, sorry, I should finish. In a just, orderly and equitable manner, accelerating action in this critical decade so as to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. So what is that? Is that strong? Is that weak? Is that a loophole? Is that a noose in which the fossil fuel industry will be gradually strangled? What is it? And like, to me, it seems it actually captures pretty well the sense that a lot of countries were trying to give, which is that fossil fuels are not the future of our energy systems. It doesn't include words about abatement of fossil fuels through CCS, which had been a red line for some.
Yep.
And it puts everything in the context of net zero, and it's itself in the context of 1.5. So, there's a little wiggle room in there, but 1.5 doesn't give you a lot of wiggle room, actually.
I mean, I look at that clause in the context of all the other ones in that list, and the next one talks about accelerating zero and low emissions technology, including abatement and removal technologies like carbon capture.
particularly in hard-to-abate sectors.
Which is like the important, I think, qualifier. Or it says particularly, so it doesn't remove it out. I think, Luke, I'm keen to hear your kind of issues with the word loophole, but I think you could look at this text looking for flaws and easily find ways people might exploit this language if they wanted to keep using fossil fuels.
Okay, let's talk about loopholes.
All right.
So the whole premise of the Paris Agreement is that countries are pursuing their many and various pathways in this joint process. Necessarily, these COPs are coming together and are agreeing text that all countries have to be broadly comfortable with, but broadly it's a consensus process, anyone can blow it up. So the ultimate loophole is that there's no real enforcement mechanism for anybody to do any of this. While they're nominally legally binding, there's no global COP that's going to come and, with a green siren, come in and say, well, I'm sorry, you have violated clause F subsection 9 of this or that climate agreement. It's just not going to happen. And so what does happen is it shifts the norms around what's acceptable and unacceptable. And, the idea that one would have ever expected there to be a text negotiated here in Dubai or anywhere else that was ironclad and forced all countries to do anything, I think fundamentally misunderstands the process.
Yeah, there never would be agreement to a 200-foot tall blue-helmeted UN Uber robot to go around and smash in the parliaments of countries that don't do what they're meant to do. And given the number of complaints we heard from the UNFCCC Secretariat today about inadequate budget provisions for them to even compile sufficient notes that they've been asked to.
There was a lot of that.
That Jaeger might sit on the drawing board for quite some time, even if it could be agreed.
Yeah. I just think that what we can hope out of these COPs is that there is a significant incremental step forward in terms of the normative understanding of what the collective task is. I mean, yes, there's loopholes, but there's always going to be loopholes. What's more significant is kind of the things that have been agreed and the ways in which the norms have been progressed. Anyway, that's my loophole corner. Either of you can chime in on that.
I agree with the point you're making on norms. Maybe the way that hit home for me was that, we had access to the text a few hours before this plenary happened. We're all reading through it. Oh, is that really, as strong as we're all hoping? What's going to be the reaction, of all these parties? And the thing that was really significant to me was the speeches and the reaction from a lot of the parties immediately after that standing ovation, who took the elements of this that they had, clearly fought for the most and sought to emphasize those. So they're effectively creating the narrative they want people to take away from this process by calling out the things, that were of the most value. So in quick succession, you saw, lots of groups, including Minister Bowen for the Umbrella Group, but also, John Kerry for the US and the EU, really emphasised the fact that this was a landmark agreement that marked the end or the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era, and that we would be transitioning away from fossil fuels. And I think the way that those parties characterise this agreement is, I think, for the purposes of the broader dialogue, almost just as powerful as the words written on the paper.
So I would agree with that, and I would also say that that's not just something that parties can do, but actually all of us who, like, if you're listening to this podcast, dear Summer Opera, you are a thought leader in terms of, like, conveying what COP means to a bunch of people in your lives who don't know a lot about it. And framing it for them and helping them interpret it, or giving them the only information they might ever get about it. And so that's not a reason to give them just happy talk or propagandize or something, but just frame their understanding in a way that will help them see what is actually useful in this process and not get caught up in all the things that are unsatisfactory but inevitable about it.
Should we draw Loophole Corner to a close?
All right. Except to say that if you put enough loopholes together, you've got a net.
I'm going to catch the carbon in a net, Tennant? Is that what's happening here?
I think the fossil fuel industry is being caught in a net. And if you put every individual clause in this as some way in which you could kind of see a way out, but if you put them all together, actually, there's not a lot of daylight that gets through.
More of a shade cloth then.
Does that mean fossil fuels are the sun? I think
Maybe,
that's quite right.
Can you go back to your
all right.
your walkthrough?
Okay. So in the rest of the energy text, we should note there's a paragraph E is a catch-all, not just for carbon capture, utilisation and storage, but all zero and low emission technologies.
All the great technologies.
Renewables.
Nuclear,
yes. The nuclear people get their first shout-out, I think, in one of these documents, and I think they're very pleased about it. So, now deliver some projects
and also
on time and on budget, please.
Low carbon hydrogen production.
Low carbon hydrogen production. Well, that's another paper, Luke.
Is that one of those loopholes that is forming a net that someone's going to get caught in?
It's got to be consistent with 1.5 degrees and net zero.
There you go.
I think we should refer summer uppers to our previous podcast where we diagnose the various colours on the hydrogen rainbow.
Yes. So there's also road transport, which is quite broad in talking about zero and low emission vehicles. There's phasing out. These were contested words over the course of the thing. Phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that do not address energy poverty or just transitions as soon as possible. There's one more thing just beneath this, though, which is another one of the possible loopholes, maybe, recognises that transitional fuels can play a role in facilitating the energy transition while ensuring energy security. What's transitional fuels? That's actually quite interpretable. It's almost certainly inclusive of gas, or a number of countries will do their interpretation dance and say that's gas. Who was asking for this? This was actually, as far as we can tell, what was needed to get the African group of countries to not blow up the thing, because there's a bunch of gas development, particularly in northern Africa, and those countries say, we need this economic development. Other countries say, there's better ways to develop your economy at this point, but a way through was needed, and this is what that way through was.
So to wrap it all up, before we sort of move on to the what happened at the plenary that Ten and I have just left, I reflect on the emergence of the concept of net zero in Paris as something which everyone was rallying around a little under 10 years ago. And that is now the framework that most governments use, a net zero or net zero adjacent concept to frame their ambition on climate change. And it is the strategic driver for businesses around the world, whether voluntarily and enthusiastically or under sufferance. This is something that they are being required to consider and is driving decision-making right around the economy. Now, are we 100% of the way there yet for every company in the world having a sophisticated and 1.5 degree aligned net zero plan? Well, obviously not. But we've come an incredibly long way along that journey. And it seems plausible to me that having established the precedent that the global consensus is that we are transitioning away from fossil fuels, that we are at a similar inflection point here in Dubai, and that it forms a basis for us to revisit this conversation over subsequent COPs, so that global consensus is strengthened. It is also a very clear signal to markets, if it is appropriately communicated and unpacked, why this has landed in this document in the way that it has. This gives folk that are investing in various energy technologies a lot of food for thought about the sorts of technologies that it would behoove them to invest in.
Yeah, quite a few of them, but not all of them.
Yeah. So, as we said, we were in the room adjacent to the room where it happened.
The room where it almost happened? No.
Well, we could have.
The room where we saw it happen from a distance.
But then we would have been in another room again.
Oh dear.
Oh.
But that's okay. They don't have to let the hoi polloi in to make these big global decisions. We were very happy and comfortable watching on the big screen, and I was settling in for the cut and thrust of discussion and debate to which we'd become accustomed over the last few days. As you know, I was looking for another spicy contribution from Bolivia, and
which eventually we got.
We eventually got it, but only after. President Sullivan LGBT sort of opened the thing, went through procedural matters, introduced the GST text and stated tenant.
There being no objection, it is so decided.
And down the gavel came.
Without skipping a beat or pausing for breath, seemingly.
Yes. Without even visibly flicking his eyes around the room to even check if there was an objection. Because for a very good reason. Because he knew that there was no objection in the room.
Yeah. So this goes to one thing that happened, which sort of emerged over the subsequent minutes, was that the small island states were not in the room.
Yes.
They came into the room after the decision was made, expressed a degree of confusion that they had been out of the room when this decision was made, and asked to read a statement.
Yes, and the statement said the sort of things that you would expect about the weakness from their point of view of the lack of phase-out language and several other respects in which they thought it was weak. And this was pretty evidently the final delicate manoeuvre that had to be agreed and allowed for in order for the deal to be done and not torpedoed without anybody, and particularly the small island states, definitively giving up or compromising on essential positions for them. So it is no accident that they weren't in the room.
And importantly, I think, while the agreement of the global stocktake text got a standing ovation, so did the intervention from the small island states.
Yes. Yes. Including from the president.
Yes.
I was just going to read a couple of sentences from their statement because it was very powerful. And to someone watching from far away, the whole episode looked very sensational to me before, obviously reflecting on the fact that the president was also giving them a standing ovation and the whole thing was clearly pretty choreographed. They sort of said we reference the science throughout the text, but then we refrain from an agreement to take the relevant action in order to act in line with what the science says we have to do. It is not enough for us to reference the science and then make agreements that ignore what the science is telling us we need to do. And then it goes on with, specific issues they found. But it was very powerfully delivered by the woman from Samoa. And as you say, Luke, she got a standing ovation. And that is definitely something that Samoa and other small island states will be pointing to when they go home from this COP.
Yeah. And look, it was a theme that as various other nations, put their hand up and made their interventions, they regularly referenced the intervention from the small island states. It was referenced by Germany. It was referenced by John Kerry on behalf of the US, who said that the applause for small island states should be taken as a clarion call to ensure we take the actions we need. And there was a strong theme both from the presidency and from a number of parties that there's some solid words in this text. All is going to depend on how that's translated into action, a clear piece of connective tissue to COP29, where, what is going to be front and centre is the conversation around nationally determined contributions.
I thought the other norm that's been established through this COP, it's lucky we weren't playing COP bingo this time around, or in combination with a drinking game in which 1.5 degrees is the North Star featured, because we would have been pretty drunk for the whole COP if we had been. But it is significant that kept being referred to in a way that, I don't think has been the case in previous COPs. And I keep going back to the Colombian minister because, she was an amazing speaker and had some really salient points here. One here, obviously related to that, is that she sought to emphasise the fact that she felt that this global stocktake is the first decision text by politicians to be so influenced by the science, and really sought to highlight the fact that, the text doesn't simply just, note the findings of the IPCC. Like, it really calls up the findings of that sixth assessment report and uses much stronger language than we've seen before. And she, applauded that and, sought to, I think ensure that this was now the norm moving forward, that all subsequent reports of that nature are similarly referenced to guide efforts and properly influence the decisions of politicians who come together to agree that text. The other line I really liked from her, and it goes to very quickly to the loophole conversation, was her concern that transition fuels could end up colonising the space of decarbonisation. I thought that was incredibly evocative language. I should probably find her speech and put it in the show notes for everyone to read, because just about everything she said was solid gold.
I have some notes. We can put a link to my last, I believe, set of highly detailed COP plenary notes for this COP.
I really hope so. There's not like a bonus plenary.
Oh, I hope. I do think we should mention one extra paragraph of the UAE consensus.
Yes, that was what it was interesting, actually. That was what Sultan Al Jaber dubbed it. Shortly after it had been adopted. Not the Dubai consensus, the UAE consensus, which is interesting.
Yes. And it's paragraph 39 of the GST decision, which reaffirms the nationally determined nature of nationally determined contributions.
That shall be determined in a nationally determined way.
In nations, determined ones.
Determined nations, that's right.
Making a contribution. And Article 4, paragraph 4 of the Paris Agreement, okay, so far so boring, and encourages parties to come forward in their next nationally determined contributions with ambitious economy-wide emission reduction targets covering all greenhouse gases sectors and categories and aligned with limiting global warming to 1.5 C as informed by the latest science in the light of different national circumstances. And why does that paragraph, as long as it is, matter? Because that is the kick in the pants to all of us, even if it's encourages, even if it's framed in national circumstances, to all of us to make our next nationally determined contributions that we're doing over the next 18 months serious. Everybody be in with serious quantified targets, and everybody align with 1.5 degrees, which is, a hard ask for anybody, actually, and is going to keep us all very busy for some time to come. This was the point of the whole thing.
Yes.
Is that paragraph.
And it was referenced by several speakers in the plenary as well. starting with John Kerry, our own minister, mentioned it also. And I think it's also significant that it points out it needs to cover all greenhouse gases. The other line I think we skipped over in that mega Article 28 also called out the need to look at reducing emissions quickly with non-CO2 gases, particularly methane. So, like, whilst you've got, a bit like the net that doesn't let much sunlight through, concerns around transition fuels and what provides potentially for more use of gas, the very next line is calling on rapid reduction in non-CO2 gases, including methane. So, like, that's significant, and we should then expect to see targets aligned to that in the next round of NCCs as well.
It's time for one more thing, in which we all share one last thought about the Conference of Parties 28. Tennant, what have you got?
My one more thing is a shout out and a commiseratory hug to Australia's climate negotiators for Article 6, international cooperation on mitigation, which did not reach a result at this COP on the critical Article 6.2 and 6.4. A red hot go was had at it. Some important points were made and cards were put on the table that they couldn't get agreement this time. It's forwarded to next COP, and like all of Australia's climate negotiators are impressive people and they've all worked very hard. But I think extra thoughts out to Article 6 lead Kate Hancock and her team, because they, as the minister says, I don't think they left anything on the field, but nobody got a trophy this time.
Indeed. Frankie, what have you got?
Mine's a personal one. I think whether you knew it or not, you might have heard the dulcet gurglings of my 3-month-old daughter, who travelled with me to Dubai, and I just wanted to reflect on the experience of having a baby at a COP. Apart from being very tired from doing that long a trip on my own with a baby, I can't help but just feel pretty great about having brought her over there because of the reactions that I got from people when I brought her around. I saw harried negotiators coming up to me saying, "Gosh, your baby's adorable. Can I just stand here and look at her for a few minutes? She's making me feel calm." Just
the COP's mental health baby.
Like an emotional support baby that I was toting around COP for the collective benefit of all. But in all seriousness, one, I think it was great to remind everyone that I saw one of the reasons we're doing this. It's not just for ourselves, it's for future generations. And the other reason I wanted to bring her, I didn't want having a baby to stop me from going, is because I care about this stuff. I'm really passionate about this. I didn't want to let the fact that I was on parental leave stop me from doing something. And so it kind of felt good to show that it can be done. Not going to pretend that it was easy or stress-free, but it was, I think it felt pretty liberating to do it. And particularly a lot of women came up to me and said they really liked seeing that I had brought my child, and they were happy to see that being modelled.
Yeah. All the nets and the shade cloths and whatever couldn't keep out the sunshine of little baby Muscovich and Big Mama Muscovich. I don't know. Let's work on that one.
I think we're adding LBM to the canon of LMSU. I'm not sure that we're going to necessarily sign on for Big Mother. Yeah. What did you say?
Let's consign it to the dustbin of history.
All right, moving on quickly. We inadvertently provided misinformation on the last episode, or just a bum steer in terms of? I mean, we could blame
Best information available at the time.
We could blame Simon Evans for this, but we won't do that.
That would be churlish.
We'll take on collective responsibility. We were speculating about the location of COP29, and at that point, various theories were spun. But as it turns out, within I think 36 hours of recording that episode, it became very clear that it would not be in any of the places that we thought, because it's actually going to be in Azerbaijan, in the city of Baku. And not only that, but there was a very exciting twofer. I think this was in a plenary on, I want to say, Sunday or Monday. I can't remember when, but some administrative issues were dealt with. And we also learned that we thought it was going to be in Brazil, and Brazil confirmed that the COP30 will be in Belém. And there was a very short moment where I thought, they're on a roll. They're just going to announce Australia as well. That did not happen.
No. And in the remarks in the final plenary, Turkey confirmed they still want it. We've still got some competition there. Yep. Don't count your chickens before they've been assigned to you by the UNFCCC.
Well, I'll tell you who is counting their chickens. The Wikipedia page for the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which lists Australia and Pacific nations as the host of COP31.
Nice.
There being no objection, it is so decided.
Gavel down.
All right. Well, it has been a delight hanging out with you both, and unpacking the goings on at COP28 over this episode and the previous episode. I guess see you in Baku.
Yeah, where a hurricane of bad puns will bring the conference to a successful conclusion.
I'll be Baku.
Oh, God. It's bad. It's bad already.
Yes, we're all very tired. We need to stop now. We're on social media, on various places, LinkedIn. I think we need to do some in the show notes. We really need to do a compilation of all of your various...
A compilation of views from all the parties.
Compilation of all of your LinkedIn notes, the heroic effort to capture every plenary that you've been involved with, every negotiation. I think that we need to put that into the show notes for posterity.
I'll add some side events too. There's a couple there, the sexy ones about carbon border adjustment mechanisms, but there's even more side events I saw.
We almost made it through an episode of LMSU without CBAM being mentioned. Pipped at the last.
Oh, yeah. Got to get it in there somewhere.
Yes. So check all that out. Fantastic content from Reed. We also have an email address, Frankie. What is it?
It is LBM stirring.
Quick, get it out. That's okay.
It is a mailbag at letmesumup.net. Flick us your papers, your hot takes, and anything else you'd like us to read.
And tell us, we have a website.
We do. It is www.letmesumup.net, and you can find our entire back catalogue of episodes of this here podcast, what you are listening to now.
And speaking of episodes of this podcast, this is the last episode proper of Let Me Sum Up, but there is one more in the near future. The famed holiday special and annual awards for best paper will be emerging at some point over the next couple of weeks. The triumphant return of Alison Reeve may feature.
Yeah.
Which we're all very excited about.
And the triumphant return of the Papies.
No, it's the Wonkies, the second annual Wonkies. I won't have you trying to resurrect the Papies, Tennant. It's not a thing.
But until then, for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.